All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Let's just really quick just go over what we did yesterday. And we went yesterday over the ruling on consuming or at least eating rabbit meat. And like I said, I know maybe not all of you are in favor of rabbit meat, but like I said, my issue is mainly with the methodology than the actual ruling itself. Why? Because when you look at the methodology, that basically, you know, builds a certain vision, a certain mindset of how we understand Islamic rulings. And that is even more important than the ruling itself. I mean, not that the ruling itself is not important, but you could see, especially when we're talking about differences of opinions between scholars, all right, if there are valid differences of opinions between scholars, whatever opinion you might choose, at the end of the day, if it's a valid opinion, you just know that there's uh, a valid opinion, meaning scholars that had considered that opinion. So in other words, you're within the safe parameter. But my concern is not about the safe parameter or not. My concern is about the vision, the methodology that you use to understand the whole way of deriving an Islamic ruling. Like we're looking at the hadith, how we research the hadith, how we go back to the authenticity of the hadith, who the scholars are that had researched this hadith and what they commented on this validation or that validation or that hadith, etc., who these scholars are. And this is extremely important. If I were to teach a subject, especially to the Muslims of today, I would really, if I wanted to choose the most important topic to choose to teach, it wouldn't be necessarily Quran. It would actually be usul al-fiqh. Because if this person is already Muslim, okay, this person is already Muslim, they just need the foundation of how to understand the basis of Islamic thinking and Islamic mindset. This is the key thing. If you don't have this foundation, then you're going to find yourself really all over the place thinking that you have the right vision, the right way of research, or not necessarily just research, but even the right way of understanding. So if I were to look at usul al-fiqh, that's going to be the foundation to knowing what resources to go back to, how to understand these resources, and how to recognize let's call it, the tools to understanding Islam itself. Because if you don't have your tools and if you don't have these resources in place, then you could easily confuse so many different things out there, thinking of it as valid and that's an appropriate mindset or a fair way of understanding Islam, when in reality you were just putting in your own, I guess, your own references, your own resources, your own confusion, your own set of self-manipulation, and then you are thinking of it as Islam. That's the dangerous thing that Jahiliyyah was founded on, and without them realizing. So if I were to look at usul al-fiqh, it actually is a combination. Think of it as this combo. It's a combination of the science of hadith, science of Quran, the science of Lugha Arabiya, and the science of tafsir as well, the science of Quran as well, the science of aqidah as well. So if you look at usul al-fiqh, that is probably the most important science that we really have to teach to the Muslims of today. to recognize the resources in order to understand Islam and not confuse and self-manipulate themselves, thinking that they are doing the right thing, having the right interpretation, when they don't really know the resources and what resources to use. So when, like I said, I really, really don't care much about whether you're going to be eating rabbit soup or rabbit stew or not, because it's a valid opinion to eat or not to eat. But what I care more about is understanding those resources. Is a prophet's companion, is a companion, is his own quotation necessarily a valid resource? How do we understand these resources? No, that's number one. Number two, how do we understand those? Who are these figures that basically are quoted in the books of hadith or in the books of fiqh to let us basically see them as credible scholars or credible figures for us to take as our role models, for us to take them as the ones that we would somehow adopt their vision to tell us if this is halal or haram. Why adopt their vision? Who are these figures? So when we see, for example, just like Abu Mijlis yesterday, we talked about Abu Mijlis, and we said Abu Mijlis and how he was taking the ilm from Anas ibn Malik and Abdullah ibn Abbas, and those are considered as the major scholars of the Sahaba. Not major scholars alone, but major scholars from the Sahaba scholars. You can't beat that one. Major scholars from the Sahaba scholars. So when you see who these people are and who their teachers were, that's when you adopted a completely different mindset, where you would not only recognize the resources in terms of books, but you would also recognize the inspiration and the teachers, and let's call it the resources of where this actually is going back to. Who is this going back to? So this isn't just taking the words of perhaps maybe Anas ibn Malik just because his name sounds nice. But no, this is actually talking about someone that was taught by the Prophet ﷺ himself. So think of him as like a disciple, okay? That he was basically taught by the Prophet ﷺ, and later he became the main teacher for Abu Mijlis or probably another tabi'i, etc. So understanding these resources and these tools basically helps you, I would say, gain a sense of appreciation for that ilm. And this is extremely important, because you will not get ilm until you recognize how to appreciate and how to honor the ilm. That's why the scholars of the past, before they even taught the ilm itself, they needed to spend some time in teaching the children or teaching the students adab talab al-ilm, the adab, the mannerisms of seeking ilm. Why? Because that was extremely important, and even coming first and prior to learning the ilm itself. Because if you don't actually have the ilm itself, then you're going to be confused about the importance of what you're learning. You're going to be that's why before you even seek the ilm, you first have to have adab talab al-ilm, the discipline of seeking ilm. This is extremely important, because if you don't have the adab for talab al-ilm, then you're not going to be capable of having that honor and that appreciation, and then that ground. Think of it as the ground, that ground to plant the seed of ilm. You would, in order to plant the seed of ilm, you would basically have to first have the ground for it. You have to have the ground for it. If you don't have the right ground for it, then you're going to find yourself confusing everything. All right, let's continue right there. So point number four, that, of course, that al-Qurtubi wanted to say was على طاعم يطعمه. In other words, talking about this ayah, what is basically considering what are the haram things to consume. On what? Well, to consume in terms of eating. Okay, and we did talk about the different words in regards to the ta'im and the different qira'at. Is it إلا أن يكون or إلا أن تكون? And one thing to say, we say this on and on again, not every single qira'ah that is different is necessarily completely different in the meaning. Sometimes it can give an additional meaning. That's number one. Number two, the additional meaning can mean to restrict a specific, to give restriction, or it can mean to give further elaboration, or it can also mean to give a different angle of rating or a different angle of explanation. So this is extremely important, not until we understand the different qira'at, and that sometimes they can give various meanings and different interpretations that are necessary. Now, not every variant qira'ah is necessarily valid, okay? Or let me correct this one. Let me use a different word. I don't want to use the word not necessarily valid, but I'll just say a qira'ah that carries the same validity, the same I guess, level of authenticity as some of those qira'at. Some of the qira'at, they're considered part of the 7 qira'at or 10 qira'at that they carry the highest weight. Other qira'at may not necessarily be as invalid per se, but it would be not carrying the same amount of validity as we would have the other qira'at. Okay, when you say a valid qira'ah, what do you mean by valid qira'ah? So a valid qira'ah would be a recitation that basically was read by the Prophet ﷺ. That's number one. Number two is that it was recited by a number of different Sahaba, and that they had mentioned that they had heard the Prophet ﷺ read this qira'ah in that way. Three, it was passed on to another generation of a set of group of scholars that had basically, let's say, learned this qira'ah, learned this variant recitation, passed it on, and then you had a large number of scholars that basically had approved and validated this qira'ah. That's what we mean by a valid qira'ah. So keeping that one in mind. Okay, so when we say that, it's important to keep in mind just a variant qira'ah is not at all considering that this is somehow a contradictory within the Quran, but no, it is basically something that even the wahi itself was also the one to reveal these variant qira'at. Okay, the Prophet ﷺ himself had actually said, I had read the Quran on various qira'at. One thing to understand is that these qira'at or these variant recitations, they're not always numerous. So some pages you might have really zero variants and they all read it in the same way. Other qira'ah might actually have just a couple words or maybe a word or two on a page, and another qira'ah might have 3 pages, 3 words, or sometimes just a slight variation in terms of maybe a haraka or two. So we just looked at it right there. Then we talked about the part a variant qira'ah can sometimes give an extra meaning. And we talked about al-masfuh right there. So when we see أو دما مسفوحة, is it talking about the gushing blood? What about the blood that we would see like meat and steak, for example, or perhaps maybe some people have a desire to eat perhaps things like liver, lung, perhaps just different intestines, or probably, I mean, intestines don't really have blood, but you'll see different organs basically having blood, or including bones, by the way. Of course, the bone marrow there basically has blood in it because that's where the blood is actually made. It's made in the bones. Okay, we usually don't think of that, but yes, it's made in the bones, and then the bones act as the company, okay, that basically makes the blood. Anyhow, so regardless of that, is it permissible or not permissible? We said two different opinions. The first one was saying that it was haram, and the second opinion said that it was not haram because the ayah in itself had basically considered that what is forbidden from blood is basically al-masfuh, which is the gushing blood, and not necessarily the blood that is within the veins or the blood that is perhaps clotted in the different parts of the different organs, just as we may talk about liver or kidney, etc., and so forth. And we said that opinion. We also talked about Abu Majlis. Yesterday, we talked about Ibn Ruslan, the Palestinian scholar, and we also talked about, who else did we talk about? So Ibn Ruslan, Ibrahim al-Nakhai. We didn't go in lots of details about Ibrahim al-Nakhai, but we left off at this ayah. وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ هَادُوا حَرَّمْنَا كُلَّ ذِي ظُفُرٍ وَمِنَ الْبَقَرِ وَالْغَنَمِ حَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ شُحُومَهُمَا إلا ما حمل ظهورهما أو الحوايا أو ما اختلط بعظم ذلك جزيناهم ببغيهم وإنا لصادقون. A couple things to say here. If you were to go to a tafsir, it's called التحرير والتنوير. It's actually one of my favorite tafsir. If I did not want to teach from Tafsir al-Qurtubi, I would have definitely gone to Tafsir Tahrir al-Tanwir. But to be honest, it's really hard to use that as a reference if you are going to be explaining the tafsir in English. The reason why it would be hard, because it goes in lots of depth in terms of Arabic grammar, the conjugation, and the semantics, and so forth. And that really becomes hard for a majority of the people to understand how to compare the Arabic grammar in English and to the English grammar, especially that it's a completely different structure. I personally would not know how to do it. I'm sure other people would probably be excellent at this. Definitely not me. Okay, so my side is more into fiqh, so that's why I chose Tafsir al-Qurtubi. Okay, here we go. So if you were to go to Tahrir al-Tanwir, he will also not only delve deep in the language itself, but he will also delve deep in the history of different parts of the ayat, or perhaps even the different sciences within the ayat. So you see Tahir ibn Ashur, who's actually the author of Tahrir with Tanwir. Now, mind you, Tahrir Tanwir is like in almost 20 volumes. I have Tahrir with Tanwir. Unfortunately, left it in America, but I have a Tahrir with Tanwir, one of my favorite tafsir right there, and it's available online, so you could actually have access and free access to that book, so it's available as well. And Tahir ibn Ashur will go deep even in the studies for the different religions and different scriptures. So let's say this is talking about the Yahud, he will go to the resources in the Tanakh, Talmud, and even Torah, and quote what was said there. Maybe because he was a Tunisian scholar, he probably maybe had access to some of the Jewish scholars to help him find the resources. I don't know how he did it, but I don't know how he managed to find these resources, but he definitely did an excellent job on that. Definitely did an excellent job on that. There is a Jewish community in Jerba in Tunisia, and they had their rabbis there. So I have no idea if he managed to get that as a resource too. Do we necessarily need to get that as a resource? Well, the answer is no, we don't need to necessarily get that as a resource, but sometimes you may have different people come with different misconceptions that you really need to go to these resources to help people see whether the discrepancy, the contradiction, or further elaboration to help them understand what they're missing out on. But the Quran should suffice to explain the ayat, and the hadith are basically there to explain, not necessarily their scripture, because their scripture in their legislature, the Jewish legislature, the Jewish scripture, etc., is not a reference that at all would be considered a reference that as Muslims we would go to whatsoever. Islam does not depend in any shape or form on the scriptures or the legislature that the Yahud are practicing in any shape or form. We do not go back to that. That was never a reference. Now, this is extremely important to say. Remember when I was in the beginning of class saying that if I wanted to teach a class that would contain all the different Islamic sciences, it would be usul al-fiqh. And this is extremely important because Talmud or Torah is not in any shape or form a reference for studying Islam. Okay, now to go back to this ayah, let me first do a couple interpretations. Number one, it said وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ هَادُوا, and upon those, the word is hadu. What is hadu? So hadu actually means to find guidance. Okay, hadu means to find guidance, and the Quran described them. So when you see hadu, this is talking about the Yahud. This is talking about the Jews. Okay, and when it says وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ هَادُوا, and upon those that had been basically at one point they were seeking to repent, but did they necessarily stay committed to the repentance? Well, that's a different story. That's a different story. But they were basically claiming to be the ones that are hadu. And here the Quran basically identifies them as hadu to mean Yahud, to mean those that had embraced the path of those that wanted to be from alladhina hadu. Okay, what happened? Haramna, we had forbidden upon them every animal. Basically, of course, you don't see the word animal here because كل ذي ظفر, if I were to just everything that has a nail, the Arabic language would basically give me the context. So in English, in order for me to explain this ayah, I would need to use a lot of different explanations because in Lugha Arabiya, it uses a lot of mustatir, or it uses a lot of the context of itself to help you understand what this is talking about. So now, كل ذي ظفر, we would know that this is based on the context that this is actually talking about animals in consumption. This isn't talking about anything else, because the only thing that would have a dhufur / nail would basically be talking about the animals. وَمِنَ الْبَقَرِ وَالْغَنَمِ, And therefore, if you are still in doubt that this is probably talking about something else, then it continues to explain. And from out of all these animals that we did not call them, we did not say they were animals, but we would know that this is talking about an animal from the context. And then, as an exception from all those types of animals that were regarded as haram, there was a set of animals that basically had an extra restriction. This extra restriction upon cows or cattle and upon sheep or goats, there were extra restrictions, basically the fat that surrounds the different organs. So we're talking about abdominal fat. We're not talking about muscle fat. The muscle fat was considered permissible, but the fat that surrounds the organs, the fat that was surrounding the intestines or surrounding kidneys, the basically in the abdomen, that type of fat was considered haram. Okay, let's say. So this is talking about not necessarily carrying on the back, but this is talking about what it would carry in terms of what would give it muscle strength. So the fat that was within the muscles, that was considered permissible. الحوايا can mean the different things that are in the abdomen, and could also mean we're speaking about what in other words, basically what the animals would discrete, or what the animals would basically, of course, release. And certainly right there, speaking about al-hawaya, anything that is in the abdomen, whether we're speaking about its own cow dung, or perhaps even just different things within the abdomen, bile, or perhaps maybe urine, or perhaps maybe all the different things within the intestine, that those were basically as part of the GI, that they were not permissible, including the fat that surrounds all of that. Or any of that is basically coiled with bones. ذلك جزيناهم ببغيهم. That is what we had restricted upon them as a result of their transgression. وَإِنَّا لَصَادِقُونَ. And we are truthful in the revelation that we send. A couple items here. Now, one thing is that you see that al-Qurtubi said that there are 6 different matters in this, in talking about this. And he said, well, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned what, so now he's talking about the context, and he said, well, the people of Quraysh, they basically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposes their referencing in terms of legislation, in how they basically use their own biases to restrict certain meats, and they considered certain animals and certain meat was basically to be exclusive for men and not permitted upon women, and so forth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposed their biases in terms of what resources they used in order to legislate. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, well, as for the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the reference was al-wahy, for legislature. And up until that moment, there were only 3 different items that were haram, and later on, of course, different items were added onto the list. And as for another form of legislation, then it would be وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ هَادُوا, and upon those that basically were the Jews, this is what was considered as haram upon them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know that there are different reasons for how we would consider as legislation. So what would regard something as number 1, ethical, or number 2, perhaps justifiable, or perhaps something that is legal, or something that is considered as something that is appropriate or not appropriate, whatever, all these different areas, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us see the different variants, that you've got one group that would consider their own ancestry or their own people, their own culture, which will carry a lot of biases. The other type is al-Wahi, and that's basically the reference that you as a Muslim would go back to, which is al-Wahi. As for the Yahud, they basically had put their own restrictions, in other words, made up some of the different legislatures that they were making it up upon themselves, and not necessarily a legislature per se, but they were creating their own interpretations. That's number one. Number two is that some restrictions may have different reasons. So number one, the basis on Islamic legislature is that it is حرمنا عليهم الخبائث أحللنا لهم الطيبات حرمنا عليهم الخبائث. The main reason for the Islamic legislature is to bring the maximizing good and basically eliminating evil. That's the main foundation in Islamic Sharia. The second foundation is discipline, is to keep us intact, basically on the ground in terms of the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number three, and that would be in terms of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described, that certain things may be restricted as a result of someone may not notice that the reason why they were restricted in this is simply because of something that they had committed, or perhaps even in your life, the reason why certain things may not have been accessible to you, it could be as a result of you perhaps maybe cutting corners, or maybe it is to get you stronger, to get you perhaps, I always say it this way, that you made the dua to be stronger, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put you in more hardship. Wait a minute, I made the dua to get stronger. Well, yes, if you overcome these challenges are going to get you stronger. You made the dua to be strong. And therefore, just recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may answer the dua in different ways to get to what is necessary for you. I always like to think of Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam when he said, Rabbi inni massani ad-durru wa anta arhamur rahimin. Ya Allah, I had been pricked with the harm or the illness, and you are the most merciful. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, Urkud birijlika hadha muhtasalun baridun wa sharab, and basically told him, well, I want you to put in a certain amount of exercise. Urkud birijlik hadha muhtasalun barid. So there was a specific type of a medication that he was supposed to be putting on his body, ointment, cream, who knows what it is, but it definitely was telling us that there was an outside medication and a sharab, a certain oral medication that he was supposed to be taking. That was the answer for the dua. Why would this be the answer for the dua when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have just said, kun fayakun? Well, that's in order to explain to us that even if you had made the dua for one thing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may answer the dua sometimes by literally giving you the thing on the spot, or may sometimes answer the dua in ways to get you to there. So don't depend on miracle, but you want to depend on basically taking the resources to get to the miracle. The resources themselves are supposed to take you to the miracle. And that's the same thing, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may sometimes restrict certain things upon you, whether perhaps you wanted to get married so bad, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted you to not get married and not find the right person right now, and postpone the time for you to probably develop a sense of appreciation when the right person comes to you. Perhaps that it was to put you in this discipline, or perhaps it was to make you stronger, or perhaps it was a punishment. Can it be a punishment? Yes, it can be a punishment. That you had done one particular thing and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is punishing for this particular behavior in this way that basically had been the result of a certain behavior that you had done. Now, how do we know if this is a punishment or whether this is a discipline? We don't really know. We don't really have a certain tip for us to know whether this is a punishment or whether this was something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was disciplining you in or into. We don't know. But that's why we would make the dua. If you remember, the Prophet ﷺ himself was making the dua when he went to Ta'if, and he was making the dua and saying, Ya Allah, if this is a punishment upon me, and he was making that dua in that regards, and at the same time was making the dua in a different way as well. So in other words, we don't really know if there isn't a specific tip to know whether this is a punishment or not. That's why we would do and practice sabr either way. Practice patience either way, because if it's a punishment, it is to discipline as well. If it's a punishment, it is to discipline. If it is basically an answer to your dua, the discipline piece of it, think of it as, you're going into different departments within your life in order to get to Jannah. Because if it's a punishment and you were not patient, then you're going to be upcoming for another punishment. And if it's a discipline and you're not patient in that discipline, then you're going to find yourself basically slipping in a downhill without you realizing, taking you also into that downhill without you recognizing that it was a moment of discipline. I always like to think of it this way. When you climb up a ladder, the higher you go up on the ladder, the more shaky and the higher the probability of you falling. And when you fall from at least, let's say, stair 12, you are more likely to get worse bruises than compared to stair 1. When you fall from stair 1, you're not going to get the number of bruises that you might be getting from stair 12. Stair 12 is definitely going to be shaky, and that's why when you go up higher, you then might need to get someone else to hold the ladder, someone else to make sure that this doesn't get shaky and then you falling off, because you're more likely to lose balance when you're basically on the top. Why is it more likely to lose balance? Certainly then, of course, when you go up, your ground, your basis is basically stronger, and when you're away from the base, you are then battling another basis that's stronger than you. The farther you are up, the more likely that the base itself may overcome your ability and your gravity up there. Just a piece of physics right there. And that's the same thing if you were to look at Islam. Just because you managed to get a PhD in Islam, memorize the Quran, and probably get, all these different perhaps maybe degrees, or maybe you had been working on your Islam for a very long time. MashaAllah, you're so good in your Islam, etc. But guess what? The slip that you might slip when you had basically reached that far, it may even be just a slip. All it takes is just a slip. Perhaps somebody praising you one day and you took advantage and you thought, well, there you go, I'm so good, and not realize that, guess what? Arrogance just penetrated your heart. And once arrogance penetrates your heart, that's when expect to go further and further in the downfall without you even realizing. That's why the scholars would always talk about the different and just like a talbis iblis. It's basically what iblis will foil. Think of it as a foil. Iblis will put a foil and make you think of it as permissible, and that this basically goes in congruence with the religion, that this is the right thing to do, etc. And then we'll give it a halal label. I see this all the time. They'll confuse themselves, they'll manipulate themselves and put on a halal label. It says halal on it, when in reality, what's inside is completely haram. And this is extremely dangerous. When we sometimes, people can study fiqh and people can study the deen, and without them realizing, they would be many times lenient on the different fatwa because they managed to basically give it a justification by saying, yeah, well, there's a valid opinion here, a valid opinion there, and without them realizing that was the shaitan's way to get you off the right track in holding on to your deen. And then you would see many of those that perhaps maybe had all these degrees. You're like, you know what, why are they so easy on their religion? Why aren't they taking their deen seriously? Why are they this? You start getting confused, but I'll tell you, this is talbis iblis right there. What is talbis iblis? Iblis is basically the shaitan's name. Okay, talbis means a foil that you would cover. It's like a garment, it's like a foil that you would put on, or like a wrapper that you would put over something to relabel all the wrong things. Just like Iblis relabeled not eating from the tree, and he said shajarat al-khuld. He labeled it. He called it shajarat al-khuld. It was just a tree, really, but he called it shajarat al-khuld, the tree of eternity. Gave it a different name, and that way he will basically now, proselytize with this new name. There's shajarat al-khuld. That's the tree that will give you eternity. That's the tree that will give you the rizq. That's the tree, and gave it a new name, called it shajarat al-khuld, and then qasamahuma, and then gave a religious interpretation, a religious foundation. Qasamahuma, he swore by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, you know what, I'm just here trying to give you an advice that is based on integrity. I'm giving you the right thing. And you know what? By Allah, I really mean that this is right for you. He swore by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He gave himself a religious appearance, a person of integrity, a person of validation, and he relabeled the name of the tree and basically confused and manipulated Prophet Adam by relabeling things. That's number one. Number two, making it have a religious appearance, a religious label. In number three, he basically had given him promises that, I promise this is going to be giving you what you are seeking as a human being. You are afraid of death. You need rizq. You need to feel empowered. And this is basically the path. It's all only within that tree. Within that tree, you've got all the resources that you need. And that's the same thing. As human beings, we always look for these resources, whether better health or better wealth or probably better maybe authority. And we are always built with that instinct, basically looking for these resources, because we feel that not unless we have better wealth, better health, and better authority, are we feeling that we had managed to contain everything. Not until then would we feel grounded. So we're always, it's part of our instinct that we're looking for better wealth because we're afraid by not getting this wealth that our insecurity is going to be the price, or perhaps the authority, people taking over, and I might not be safe, and all the list goes on, and my children will not be able to go to school, and I'm probably not going to make it to having maybe the right food or the right resources, and I'm going to be struggling, etc. All these different things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that ash-shaytanu ya'idukum al-faqr. Shaitan is always manipulating you and telling you that if you don't go through these resources, the haram resources, basically, that the consequence or your ending is basically going to be poverty or lack of resources or insecurity, or perhaps maybe you're not going to be healthy, something's going to happen to you. So shaitan is the one that's spewing this fear in your head. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on the other hand, is telling you no. For المؤمنين لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, I want you to feel secure. I want you to feel safe. I want you to feel happy. Shaitan, on the other hand, is basically what يحزن. The ayah in Surah Al-Mujadil, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that shaitan is always spewing لِيَحْزُنَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, to basically make the believers sad, depressed, afraid, insecure, and always feeling that there is probably something dangerous going to happen. And this is extremely important because this is one of the different, let's call it misdiagnosed as mental disorder, but it is actually a spiritual disorder. It's a spiritual disorder. When we're talking about huzn, we're talking about those different symptoms. We're talking about sorrow. We're talking about fear, insecurity. We're talking about losing hope. We're talking about afraid of possibly maybe poverty, maybe bad health, maybe death, maybe the list goes on and on in terms of all these paranoia, that a lot of what is today classified as a mental disorder is in fact in Islam is actually part of a spiritual disorder. It's a spiritual disorder. But of course, during our times, and because you're looking at the departments of psychology, basically hijacked by I would say the atheists, and of course they would say that, hey, we're just matter in motion. They're not going to believe in the psyche to mean the spirit and to mean the inside of who you are, and etc. No, they see you as a matter in motion. So we just need to play on certain things to manipulate the person, to basically let them feel all of that, because life in general to an atheist is all nothing but really a fake thing. It's just matter in motion. But Islam tells you that no. I want to redirect your focus to know that the hope is in Allah, that the security is through Allah, that your rizq is through Allah, that your success is through Allah. And now you would know that there's no khawf and no huzn, that there's no fear and there's no sorrow. Okay, so once we get that in place, okay, that's when we're going to see that legislature itself. Now we're going back all the way to the legislature. That legislature itself may sometimes, even in your life, you may not get certain privileges that your other friend probably put in less effort, but they got it. They put in less effort, but they got perhaps the privileges that, even despite the fact that you put in perhaps maybe triple the effort, but you didn't get it. Why so? Why so? Why, despite the effort, this one got it, and because we usually think, based on a materialistic thinking, that it's always, if there's an amount of effort, then this is what brings the conclusion. In Islam, he tells you that no, it's not an issue of the amount of effort, but you have to recognize that there are other components and other forces that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may put in, and you not realize what force is actually working on the other end to help basically bring in the different things that relate to your life. You never know what it is. we have a restaurant, two restaurants right next to each other. One Indian restaurant, which also serves the same exact foods that a Yemeni restaurant right next to it. But this Yemeni restaurant, if you were to go inside, it's not well maintained. It's as plain as you could imagine. Okay. And the food that they serve is pretty much the same food as the Indian restaurant. In the Indian restaurant, they say the same exact food, the same exact food. And in fact, the Indian restaurant, the colors are outstanding, the inside, the design, everything's outstanding. But then you go to the Yemeni restaurant and it would be packed, and people are lined up, literally lined up, waiting for their turn to be seated. And yet, right next door, literally like right next door, you would have the people that work in the Indian restaurant really just passing out flyers. And they would be passing out flyers, and you look into their restaurant, there's literally zero people basically sitting in this beautiful place inside. SubhanAllah, the rizq here and the rizq, even though it's the same food, it's the same type of mandi, fasha, or whatever it is, the same foods here and there, the same things, and all of in fact, the Indian restaurant, and when you talk about Indians, man, they really know how to work around with all those spices. They are not to compete with. Okay. And subhanAllah, but you will see this restaurant full, and this restaurant basically empty, struggling to just get one customer. Just one customer. And subhanAllah, that's the thing. Even though there's definitely a lot more effort to do the right thing here, and less effort probably in the design and etc., but you're talking about rizq. Rabbil Alameen works his way. Why did he put this barakah in here? Or why did he put the rizq more there, not here? At the end of the day, is that we need to recognize that there are mysterious ways to you, they're mysterious, but to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's basically his sir. It is the secret of the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on how things are determined, how things are distributed, how things are basically working by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, we don't look as mu'mineen, we don't look at our action as what brings rizq, but we would consider that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a razaq. We don't consider the medication what brings healing, but we would consider that you may take the medication and it wouldn't work. But we would consider that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a shafi. We would consider that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to give victory. You may put in the right planning, the right strategic planning, and all the ammunitions right, etc. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the one, an-nasr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to give victory. Same thing. There are certain things, if you look at, especially, it's quite interesting, especially when you look at children. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not say يَرْزُقُ مَن يَشَاءُ إِنَاثًا وَيَرْزُقُ مَن يَشَاءُ الذُّكُورَ, but he said يَهَبُ لِمَن يَشَاءُ إِنَاثًا وَيَهَبُ لِمَن يَشَاءُ الذُّكُورَ. And there's a difference between the word rizq and hiba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in regards to rizq, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says فَاسْعَوْا فِي مَنَاكِبِهَا, or فَامْشُوا فِي مَنَاكِبِهَا. And there's that sa'i. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to put the effort. You need to figure out, how to basically work out your farm, the right soil, the right fertilizer, the right amount of water, all the different things that basically make good plantation and good cropping and all of that. Okay. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, basically telling us to work out and recognize that there are certain factors to make a good production. But when it came to speaking about children, he said, يَهَبُ لِمَن يَشَاءُ إِنَاثًا وَيَهَبُ لِمَن يَشَاءُ الذُّكُورَ. What is the difference? In the first one, he was giving us a hint that there were some factors that can increase the production and therefore increase the risk. Good management, whatever it is, all these different things that we talked about. But when it comes to children, it's not necessarily coming in with, perhaps certainly there are times that are considered the right time for ovulation, the right time you could check temperature, you could check the number of days since the last period, and all these different things you can see. Then they'll tell you the expected ovulation date and all of that, and increase the chances of getting pregnant. But at the same time, you can do all of your homework, okay? You can do all your homework, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you all that homework may still not work because there's another force that is the force of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that works out there to basically make al-hiba. Al-hiba is a gift and not necessarily an effort that you would put. It's a gift. Because the other one is sa'i. You don't do sa'i to get children. It's a hiba. It's a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So your daughter, your son, they're a gift. It's a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. See them as so. See them as a gift to increase your chance to get to Jannah. And that's why even when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Prophet ﷺ had encouraged getting children, he encouraged getting children because they can be a tool to basically increase and maximize your chances of going to Jannah. Yes, absolutely. إذا مات ابن آدم قطع عمله إلا من ثلاث. If the son of Adam dies, three things are the only things that would maintain after their death. And one of them, he mentioned, وَلَدٌ صَالِحٌ يَدْعُو لَهُ. A salih, a son that is an offspring, a son or a daughter that's making dua for them. Certainly did mention sadaqah jariyah, an ongoing donation, or ilm yantafi' bihi an-nas, or ilm that people will benefit from, all of that, certainly. All of that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ya Rabbi, grant us all of that. But one thing to keep in mind is that just because you may have done your homework on one end, know that there's another force. And same thing when we talk about legislation, just keep in mind that with legislation, the same exact thing, just as there is a force to give, there's also another force to take. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the one that He is al-mu'ti, and He's also the one that al-mani'. He's al-mani' and He's al-mu'ti. He's the one that would restrict, and He's also the one that would give. He's the one to give victory, and He's the one al-mu'izz, al-mudhil. He's the one that gives basically honor, and He's the one that basically would humiliate as well. Is that contradictory of what? No, it's to show encompassment. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encompasses all those forces that you may not recognize. So don't just say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking people up, but He's also the one that can actually humiliate and bring them down. Same thing. So what is that to reflect? That's to reflect Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power in all directions in order to basically let you know that His force is what dictates everything that you may realize and not realize, even when it comes to how you get to the resources or how you may not get to these resources. And this is extremely important to keep in mind, because sometimes I didn't get to probably memorize the Quran. Is it because of a sin that I had committed? Or I didn't get to maybe get a degree in Islam, or maybe didn't get to get the opportunity to study this and this. Is it some because of something that I had done? Well, could be. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even tells us in Surah At-Tawbah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know that al-munafiqeen, he said, ثَبَّطَهُمْ, what happened? What did they do? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَرِهَ اللَّهُمْ بِعَاثَهُمْ وَقِيلَ اقْعُدُوا مَعَ الْقَاعِدِينَ. They were not welcome. And in fact, he didn't want them to join along. He said, فَثَبَّطَهُمْ وَقِيلَ اقْعُدُوا مَعَ الْقَاعِدِينَ, because he didn't want them joining along. Why? Because of a sin that they had committed. Why was I not part of Gems of Light? Why was I part of Gems of Light? What is the barakah in it? What is the, if I failed to attend a class, what happened? Was there some sin that I had committed that probably made me lose that enthusiasm? And I want you to look at this one. Regardless of what they Yahud, this is probably the key wording within this sentence. The key wording within this ayah is really this piece of it. ذلك جزيناهم ببغيهم. This is the key one right there. ذلك جزيناهم ببغيهم. This was a result of what they had committed. In other words, what you do is going to determine what privileges you might get. What you do may also determine what failures you come across. And what you do may also determine the major success, Jannah, or the major failure, Nas'Allah al-afwa wal-afiyah, hellfire. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know that what you do is that at the end, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ رَهِينَةٌ. Every single soul is basically restricted, or it is curtailed by its own actions. Your own actions are going to determine your successes. They're going to determine your failures. They're going to determine your happiness. They're going to determine your sorrow. They're going to determine your insecurities. They're going to determine so many different things that is definitely right now dictating your life. You know, I would come across a lot of people, especially during our time today, that we would get a lot of people basically complaining that they are victims of this and victims of that. And of course, in the modern psychology, it's always considering that no one is guilty and everybody, whatever they might do, they're just a victim of something. In other words, they're not the ones to be held accountable. And of course, the therapists are basically trained to just give the validation to what you are feeling and how you basically see the world. And they're not at all going to be telling you that what you are doing is right or wrong, because in the premise of psychology, there's no such thing as right or wrong, because it does not even consider religion as anything but a myth. And therefore, the only thing that we would consider, according to, of course, the atheist premise, is that, well, since this world is nothing but matter in motion, then therefore there's no definition of justice, no just definition of truth, no definition of a valid resource or anything ethical or not ethical. It's just basically people's view on it, or probably the government and its restriction. But at the end of the day, they don't necessarily regard of anything as being right and wrong. So what the therapist is going to do to you is basically validate your feelings and just somehow empower you, quote unquote, to continue with whatever you're doing, and just make you feel that, you know, it's just the outside world. You're a victim to all of this, but it's just the outside world gone wrong. Islam tells you, well, wait a minute. No. Don't play the victim card. If you are a victim, but you have the power to either, while you were there, in other words, you were a factor to be in the situation that you are in, or you have the power, or may have the power to change the situation if you were to take a different step, then you can't play the victim card anymore. Then you are a factor to what is happening to you. And this is extremely important. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, well, no, if you are in a situation of abuse or etc., then you have to do your homework to get yourself out of the abuse. Don't wait for a miracle. You need to do your homework. لا يحب الله الجهر بالسوء من القول إلا من ظلم. You have to seek your help. You have to seek the different ways, but not play the victim card. Don't play the victim card. Certainly, there are certain people that may be victims. You know what? My phone broke. I started crying for like 2 hours yesterday. So I take my phone. There was a store, or I guess a phone place to fix phones nearby. And I take it to this place. The boy turned out to be a Syrian boy. Let me say why I called him boy. Because he's literally a boy. So he really had a very baby face, and he fixed the phone, and I said, do you know Arabic community, people that I can know if there are any activities for my kids around here? Can I have your mom's phone number? Maybe I can communicate with her. And he said, my mom actually died. I said, oh, sorry to hear that. And I said, okay, your stepmother. He said, my father died. I said, okay, who are you living with? Because he clearly looked like a baby face. And he said, I'm living alone. I said, what do you mean you're living alone? How old are you? And he said, I'm 16. I said, how long have you been living alone? And he said, for 3.5 years. I said, what do you mean 3.5 years? You were only 13 and a half when you were living alone? He said, yes. I said, wait a minute, 13 and a half living alone? How did you get here? Anyways, because he was a Syrian boy. How did you get here? And he said, it was my mom and I, we fled the war from Syria. We came to Malaysia. My father died in Syria. My mother and I, we came here. My mother then, after coming here, died of cancer, and I was basically left stranded and homeless, and I had to figure myself out. I was in tears. 13-and-a-half-year-old boy, his mother dies of cancer. He's left alone. No one is there. Here I am in a country that doesn't recognize me, don't even know what to do, how to not be homeless. This is enough to break men. This is enough to break men, let alone a 13-and-a-half child. 13-and-a-half young years old. That's so young. Managed to basically learn how to fix phones and actually work. I was in tears every time I remember it yesterday. And he's 16 years old, but of course I can't give him a hug, but I just said, you know what? Just consider me as your mom. You need food, you need any support, just consider me as your mom right there. I'm definitely old enough to be your mom. But, subhanAllah, it was, just saddened. You never know what's out there behind these people, just, Ya Allah, Ya Allah. How did, but at the end, Rabbil Alameen will give. There's a story. It's not an authentic story, by the way. It's not an authentic story, but it is mentioned in Al-Isra'iliyat, at least. But I like that story. I like that story, even though we don't necessarily have an authentic reference. Let me tell you the story. The story goes as follows. Prophet Sulaiman sees this woman carrying two boys. And she was in this attempt to cross this river. The river basically goes fast, and well, it was fast, and the mother drowns and dies. The children, one basically is left because she was attempting to take one child at a time. So one child, while she was carrying him, trying to take him to the other side of the river, basically the mother dies in the middle, gets drowned, basically gets drifted away. The one child basically stays on one side of the river, and the other child basically stays on the other side of the river. And then certainly, of course, these children, they're never probably going to meet each other again because they're probably not even going to even remember their own names. So Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, of course, that's, the legend goes as follows, that he asked, why separate these two brothers? Why not make them as basically supporters for one another? And then he said that basically the legend goes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, well, what you had not known is that the one on the right side of the river basically became a king on that side, and the other one basically became a king on the other side. And if they were to be together, they would have probably fought one another to basically be in that position of kingdom. So now each one was giving a rizq, even though, like I said, a legend, we don't really have an authentic resource for that, but it was just a legend mentioned. SubhanAllah, I mean, regardless of level of authenticity, but it's, just trying to at least present that the different ways that you may not know what empowerment this child was given, or perhaps maybe you were given as a result of a divorce, as a result of in-laws that were probably mean to you, or as a result of perhaps maybe abuse, or a result of whatever it is. Islam tells you, listen, you have the power, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises you that you have the resources, but you just need to work out the discipline to, one, realize these resources, two, use these resources, three, connect with the power of Allah and don't depend on your power alone. Because your power alone does not make everything and is not the only factor to how things function in this world. There's another power that's a major power, and that's the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why we memorize and learn the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you look at ذَلِكَ جَزَيْنَاهُمْ بِبَغْيِهِمْ, that's in order to let us know that your actions, whether in good or whether in wrong, that this could actually result in the opportunities being missed, or the opportunities being brought to you, or the privileges being missed or coming to you. So what would increase rizq, for example, is istighfar. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah al-Talaq. In what surah? Surah al-Talaq. Why Surah al-Talaq? Because, there's nothing more in a woman's life that may break her or make her as much as divorce. Because when a woman gets into a marriage, she goes in with all the commitment, sincerity, and basically faith in this person that he's worth not only my time, but he's worth my body. That's what it means for a woman to get married. He's worth my body. I'm willing to surrender my body to carry his own baby. That's for a woman. And when a divorce happens, it really just tears her and splits her, because how do I see these children that are part of me, but part of perhaps my abuser or whatever it is? And here it is, when you look at talaq, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically in Surah Al-Talaq, if you were to look at it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ. Whoever holds on to taqwa, يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا, He'll make an exit for them. Why? Because at that moment, when you're a situation of talaq or a situation of, what you had really invested all your effort and all your time in, what you're really seeking is a makhraj, is a way out, is an end to this blockage that you feel caged in. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I want you to live it-taqwa. But wait a minute, if I were to live taqwa, that's going to restrict me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, no, that you say as a restriction is actually your area of opportunity. And that's why he said, يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ. And he will give you the provisions from where you would least expect it. Why where you would least expect it? You would probably least expect that there would be this rizq coming from this place or that place, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting you know that what defines rizq is not necessarily you cutting corners and seeing those factors. What defines rizq is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ. And then he tells you, إِنَّ اللَّهَ بَالِغٌ. The Lord Almighty, His enforcement, His power is beyond all, and it is what controls every single corner without you realizing in this world. Just remember that. What do I need to do? Connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principles. Don't cut corners. Stay intact with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's orders. So when he says that جَزَيْهِمْ بِبَغْيِهِمْ, that's in order for us to see that even the things that it doesn't have to be haramna to mean as a legislation itself, but haramna may also mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically restricted it upon them through that. They made a restriction on themselves, but that's because they had been manipulating themselves that this is the way. It's the same thing. If you were to look at, for example, a sister going through maybe the wrong path, and then she gets ditched by that boy, and another boy, and abused by a third boy, and fourth boy, and then she starts going into depression, and now she's on antidepressants and all of that. And she might think, well, you know what? Why am I ditched by all these people? Well, the whole method, the whole system that you went through is basically going to take you to that consequence. That's the whole system. And what you end up with is that haramna, everything that was supposed to be easy access to you, now you don't have access, and the men that are looking to get married now, they don't see you as anymore as the right girl for them. Why? Because to them, oh, she's already with that boy and already with that boy. In other words, what you end up with is that حرم عليك الرزق الصالح. You decided to go the wrong path. Now the right good path is right now not going to be available to you because you had decided to go that way. You decided to go that way. That's why I always say, if you are looking to get married, you be the right girl and the right boy will find you. You work on having that taqwa. وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ. And your rizq and your good guy will come no matter where you are, no matter where you may be. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring him to your door. To your door. Wallahi al-azim. Without you realizing. Bring him to your door. Okay, let's continue. So when you look at وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ هَادُوا حَرَّمْنَا, there are a couple things here. In, of course, the Jewish scriptures, they do consider that there are certain fats and certain parts of the animal that is not permissible to eat and not permissible to consume. And that's basically what we would say even in the Torah and certainly the Old Testament and so forth. And they would basically have it in Leviticus and chapter 13 and chapter 7 that they were forbidden from eating certain fats, for example, or even certain parts or certain types of animals. So for animals, they were basically forbidden in Leviticus chapter 11. They were forbidden from eating different animals, or actually, let's start with the animals that they may eat, the ones that have split hooves and chew the cud. But they may not eat camel, rog badgers, hare, and pig. Oh, okay, so what do these look like? I'm just gonna, so what I decided to do was basically open up some of those. So this is basically this hyrax or this animal right there. Kind of looks cute, but yeah. So this one, they're forbidden from eating it. And we know the rest. So we already know, hold on, the other ones that are, the hare is basically no split hoof. So that's basically a type of a rabbit, basically. A pig, well, we know that one. And camels, they're not permitted to eat those. As basically in Deuteronomy, it basically chapter 14, verses 4 to 8, that's basically what it tells them that is forbidden on them. But in the Quran, it basically tells us that according to this ayah, that the animals that have a single hoof or a fused toe. And so when you look at which animals have a single hoof or a fused toe, that's why if you were to look at Tafseer al-Qurtubi, basically went in details with these animals, and they said, well, camels, ostrich, geese, and ducks. So I had no idea what their feet look like. I never, never thought to look at their feet. I'd never thought of looking at their feet. So this is an ostrich foot. Okay, here goes, of course, their nails. Okay, so this is كل ذي ظفر, and here's their nail. Okay, and I thought, let's say the other one, and this is basically the ostrich. Let's see the duck feet, and here's that little piece of nail right there. And let's see the geese. Never thought of looking at the geese. Hold on, let's see, never. So this is a goose's foot, basically a nail right there. And let's see the camel. And this is the camel. Camel foot, you could see, also has a nail. And of course, certainly the ayah says that every animal that basically has a dhufr. So you had different qira'at for dhufr or dhifr, or let's say right there, or dhifr, dhufr. At the end of the day, it basically is talking about a nail. So basically these animals that have nails similar to a basically human nail, that was what was considered as forbidden. Is that the case that what was mentioned in the Torah? So according to basically the Torah, it was talking about split hooves and choose the cud. Okay, so mentions that one. And the animals with single hoof, basically llama, and basically camels, and fused toes, like the animal that we showed earlier, which is that. Hold on, let me see that animal that we showed, that hyrax, I think it's called. This guy. I don't know how his feet look like, to be honest. These are his feet. Okay. No, I don't know what, this is his foot. Okay. Can't really see it, but let me see. Maybe I should put Hyrex foot, maybe, and just see. I have no idea what his foot looks like, to be honest. I never met any. Okay, this is his foot. Looks like a cat foot, doesn't it? I can't. This is not a good picture. Okay, let's see this one. Does he have a nail? Oh, wow. Yeah, he does have a nail. Look at that. Never saw that really, to be honest. I know. Okay, he's got nails. Okay. Well, yeah, my mom is absolutely, absolutely, she just hates seeing nails. And yeah, so I'm sure the first thing that would come across my mom's eyes is when she sees his nails, she's like, oh, we need to cut these. Okay. All right, let's see. Now let's go back to what we were saying. So the animals with fused toes, clawed, fused toes. So are we also talking about ducks and geese? Yes. Clawed animals basically with claws, lions, tigers, wolves, dogs, cats, bears, elephants, birds of prey, like hawks and eagles. Well, we talked about that in Islam. All right. Elephants, some scholars include them according to Jewish scholars. But of course, why does the Quran actually consider that was something that they were restricted from? They were restricted from it as a punishment. Not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded that these animals are necessarily containing anything that is lack of hygiene or anything that is not good, but they were forbidden from eating them as basically a punishment. Okay, so in Lugha Arabiya, just wanted to note that one. If it has hafir, that would basically mean that it basically would dig into the ground. Okay, that would be a hafir. And the mikhlab is that it basically rips things. So it would have claws and it would dig through, I guess, the prey and its own flesh in order to eat and basically dig through it. And dhufur is the nail that we had basically seen on the ostrich, the nail right there. So dhufur is basically to get something. So when we say dhafara, it basically means to get something. So what is it getting and why does it actually have a nail? I don't really know much about their anatomy or even about their life regardless of that, but just wanted to, I guess, just kind of let you see in Arabiya in how the anatomy and the description of the wordings basically I guess come from the whole idea of the behavior and what they do and how the description of the anatomy for that animal is coming from the behavior and what they do. Okay. All right, let's continue right there. So and وَمِنَ الْبَقَرِ حَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ شُحُومَهُمَا. And from the cows and from the sheep, basically, they were forbidden from eating شُحُومَهُمَا. And here al-Qurtubi said, well, that would mean a thub, and this is talking about the thin layer of fat, and certainly the different layers of fat that surround liver, kidney, basically different parts of the GI system. Okay, so that's basically the fat, and according to the ayah, that's basically what was considered as forbidden, and any fat that's basically fused to bones, that was basically forbidden, but they were permitted to eat the fat that is basically on the sides or even on the buttocks or even on the spine. Okay, so let's see. What about fat in terms of Jewish resources? What does it actually say? Why am I going back to the Jewish resources? Just to break it down, just so that we would see deeper, certainly deeper in the ayat. We want to see the chronology of when that ayah was revealed. What do we know about them at the time and what do we know now? Did Muhammad ibn Abdullah know what type of restrictions, dietary restrictions they had? The answer is no. They wanted to deny that, actually. The Jews wanted to deny that, and that's why the ayah basically had come in to say, you know what, you want to deny that and say that the Prophet ﷺ did not come with the right information, so that's insisted, وَإِنَّا لَصَادِقُونَ. We know what we're talking about. We know exactly the resource. We know the history of such dietary restrictions and what you actually did and what you have in your scriptures. The Prophet ﷺ did not have access to these scriptures because they were actually not Arabized. They were not translated into Arabic. And at the time, the scriptures were only in Hebrew. And certainly the Prophet ﷺ did not have access to the dietary restrictions and all of that. But then the Quran comes in to expose the Yahud and what they actually have within their basically resources, and then the ayah exposed exactly what they had and said, وَإِنَّا لَصَادِقُونَ, and we are truthful and we know exactly what we're talking about. In other words, you cannot right there think that you had exposed our discrepancies because we know exactly what's in your resources. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically exposing them right there. So according to, let's say, the Jews, what is considered as permitted kosher fat or permitted fat, basically, or kosher, what in Hebrew, all right, which is called the shuman, which is basically the normal body fat on the animal. So that's allowed to be eaten, be cooked, and no restrictions on that. And certainly, this is talking about the muscle fat. We'll talk about it there. The forbidden fat, which is the shalev or the non-kosher fat, well, that's basically the fat that surrounds the kidneys, the flanks, the lower back, stomach, intestines, liver area. Those are basically different, according to them, from the muscle fat. And therefore, you could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had also mentioned in this ayah, حَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ شُحُومَهُمَا. We had forbidden upon them or restricted them from the fat that basically surrounded basically the GI system, or basically around the abdomen right there. So that's basically right there. شُحُومَهُمَا إِلَّا مَا حَمَلَ ظُهُورُهُمَا is basically talking about the fat that is the muscle fat. الحوايا would basically, like I said earlier, but basically include all the different, whether we're talking about the bile, we're talking about their feces, or we're talking about all the different things that are in the abdomen. Basically, all of that was restricted. And وَمَا اخْتَلَطَ بِعَظْمٍ, and what was basically connected with the bones. Okay, let's see. So when you look at إِلَّا مَا حَمَلَتْ ظُهُورُهُمَا, and of course, whether we're speaking about all those that are in the abdomen, the question is, as Muslims, okay, regardless of what they basically had as a restriction in their religion, okay, as Muslims, okay, are we permitted to consume all of that? Now, we know that all of this, at least in terms of the animals that may have hooves or chew cud, or any of that, that in Shariat Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallam, that all of that was abrogated. So we don't follow the kosher rules or the kosher rules that the Jews would consider. We have our own definition of what is halal, our own definition of what is considered a dietary restriction or permissible, or etc. In other words, many times people would come to me and say, is everything that is kosher halal? I would say no. Not everything that is kosher is necessarily halal, because they have their dietary restrictions that's completely different than ours. And we don't regard their dietary restrictions as necessarily the reference that would apply to us. We consider we have our own dietary restrictions, and kosher is basically considering their dietary restrictions. Their dietary restrictions are completely different. They've got their own restrictions, they've got their own rules, etc. We don't apply their restrictions on us and whatever applies to them, they may consider something that is halal to them. Kosher basically means halal, okay? Halal to them, okay? But just because they consider it halal, we may not consider it halal. So, for example, they may use wine on certain foods. They may use, for example, certain things that they consider as halal or permissible, but we don't consider it so. We don't consider it so. So not everything that is kosher is necessarily halal. Okay. So at the end, we basically have to abide by the dietary laws, basically the diet laws based on Islam. And thanks for the halal, I guess, supervision right there to look at what's halal and what's not halal. And certainly for kosher, not only are they looking at the resources or the ingredients, but they're also considering that the rabbi is supposed to bless this. They take a lot of money for this blessing, by the way. Yes, imagine. But anyhow, all right. So what if they had slaughtered their animals based on the Torah way, the Torah restrictions, okay? And then whatever was forbidden upon them, they basically left it. Are we permitted to eat that or not? Like what? Well, like, for example, the fat that surrounds the kidney and all of that, or perhaps the intestines, or perhaps maybe just the different fats that are around the bones or whatever it is, or perhaps let's say the animals that are ostrich, or, they're forbidden from eating that, but we're not forbidden from eating that. And let's say they slaughtered it, okay? Are we permitted to eat that or not? Differences of opinions between scholars. Okay, just keep that one in mind. Differences of opinions between scholars on that. And Malik, I want you to look at this one. في كتاب Muhammad. What do you mean, في كتاب Muhammad? Like what? In the Quran? No. كتاب Muhammad ibn Sahnun. كتاب Muhammad ibn Sahnun. Okay, so why are you bringing Muhammad ibn Sahnun up? Like, how do we understand Muhammad ibn Sahnun? What does he have to do with this? So when you look at al-Malikiyya, they basically had different major resources. They were al-Mudawwana, they were al-Wadiha, al-Utbiyya, al-Muwaziyya, and Saba' Isa min al-Mabsut. Okay, those are the 5 resources. Do it again. Al-Mudawwana, al-Wadiha, Utbiyya, al-Muwaziyya, and Sama' Isa min al-Mabsut. Those are the main resources. Okay. Now, when you look at, for example, in Mudawwana, it basically has the students, they were present and they would basically learn that, but there were different narrations to al-Mudawwana. And in Mabsut, there were different shuruhat, different interpretations, and etc. Now, as for example, you look at Sahnun, Muhammad ibn Sahnun, he basically was coming in and he was one of the key scholars. And I actually prepared to talk about Muhammad ibn Sahnun, but we'll talk about that tomorrow, inshallah. Right. And Muhammad ibn Sahnun being the key scholar, basically from the Maliki scholars, he basically had mentioned that according to Imam Malik, according to his narration, is that what the Jews do not consider in what they had slaughtered something, and if it's not included in what was considered as their dhabiha, he said that would not be considered as permissible to us because they did not include it. Okay, so that's basically according to one narration. Another narration, Sama' al-Mabsut from Risa, remember, is that it is actually permissible. And let's see another track upon Malik. And well, bihi qala ibn Nafi', so right there that it is halal. And Ibn al-Qasim said another opinion. So who's Ibn al-Qasim and why are we even going? Because Muhammad Ibn Suhnun, and because Ibn Nafi' and because Abdul Rahman ibn al-Qasim, they are all considered as resources that trace all the way back to Imam Malik. Why are we even talking about Imam Malik? Because remember, the book that we're that even in the Malik one is that it's haram, the second one is that it's halal, the third one is that it's basically hated. Okay, my internet connection is telling me basically that it's starting to go slow. And what we're going to do, now I just wanted to finish this point. Let's see, is it two? Yeah. Okay, what I'll do, I'll go to a different room. Maybe that'll help me get a better connection. Okay, I'm just going to finish this point. Well, actually, yeah, because there are so many different things I wanted to talk to you about. Muhammad ibn Sahnun, and I wanted to talk to you about Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim, and wanted to talk to you about Ibn al-Mundhir as well. So how about this? Inshallah, tomorrow, there are several scholars that we need to talk about in regards to answering this question. So stay tuned for tomorrow to answer this question and even talk about other scholars and give us more inspiration from other scholars and knowing about them, knowing about their life. So definitely, try doing a lot of note taking, because when you do note taking, it basically keeps that ilm in your head once you note that down. And when noting things down, basically basically has a connection between what your hand and what your fingers touch and the information that is kept in your brain. Studies are right now showing that when you write things down, you are more likely to memorize it than when you type it. So yeah, with those fingers, wonder if there's something hidden in this finger that I need to see that's probably connecting, I don't know, my fingertips with my brain cells. Who knows? That'll be really interesting. But anyhow, regardless of that, stay tuned for tomorrow, inshallah. If there are any questions right now, writing and memory, exactly. So what we'll do right now, we'll end right here, but inshallah, tomorrow we'll continue in answering this question. Okay. And for now, you just have 3 different opinions. So we'll stop at here, and then inshallah we'll continue tomorrow. Any questions for now? And if you would like to unmute yourselves, go ahead. I would be really happy to hear what you would like to suggest, say, or even comment, or even, I guess, yeah. All right. So what I'm going to do, since no one wants to unmute themselves, and sorry for the